Being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. From the co-director of Shrek and the visionary behind Toy Story comes Spellbound, a magical new animated adventure starring Rachel Zegler, John Lithgow, Jennifer Lewis, Nathan Lane, and Titus Burgess with Javier Bardem and Nicole Kidman. When a powerful spell turns her parents into monsters, Princess Elian must journey into the wild to reverse the curse before it's too late. Watch Spellbound only on Netflix November 22nd.
In 2012, director Sam Mendes and star Daniel Craig gave the world an explosive introspection into the world of secret agents, espionage, and aging.
In 2024, we go wheels up with a James Bond classic.
The film is Skyfall.
The whiskey is Bowmore 22-year Aston Martin.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
The name's G. Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 2012 James Bond classic, Skyfall.
Bob, you know what we were talking about right before we got on that I think the audience needs to know?
We were talking about a lot of different things. I don't know where you want to go with this. Enlighten me, Brad.
The James Bond theme song is freaking incredible.
I don't think we can get a copyright strike for just humming it.
We probably will.
Let's just do it anyway. All right, so here's the thing about the theme song is that we were just breaking this down. At its most basic, pure level, like the chord progression and the sort of underlying bass notes that like bum, 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 it's so easy to remember. But then everything on top of that, the melodic part of the James Bond theme, is what makes it even better. Like it's a perfect theme because any part of it that you want to hum, if you want to do the little orchestral stinger at the beginning, the ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-da-da-da-da, it's freaking great. If you want to do the electric guitar like Brad just did, it works perfectly. Like, there's no part of that theme that isn't just perfection.
And like at this point, it has been stamped upon the cultural consciousness that like you can play it anywhere and it's so recognizable that you can't divorce it from James Bond. Mm-hmm. Like, it's smooth and classy and elegant and rich and like awesome. And like it's everything you want James Bond to stand for. And it's amazing to me that it has been around for so long and it still freaking rocks.
It's the perfect remnant of the Bond film's early 60s roots. So Dr. No comes out in 62, From Russia with Love in 63, and then Goldfinger in 64. And by the time you get to Goldfinger, the sort of musical identity of Bond has really taken shape. And I think it's just perfect because that's where you get that sort of modern, twangy, almost like surf style guitar in the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if the Bond theme had developed in the later part of the 60s, like when the Beatles went from being the Mop Tops to being on LSD, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like the theme would have developed in such a way that it would sound like not just cheesy old, quote unquote, but actually like antiquated. And I think there's something about the particular style that they hit on in the early 60s with that theme that it feels more timeless than anything.
100%. And I think this is the proper place to start because in a lot of ways, Skyfall feels like a culminating moment in the history of the James Bond franchise. And I just felt like we had to start this episode by starting at the start and saying the first thing you often hear in a James Bond film is the theme. and it never gets old for me.
This is the third Bond film that we have done on our show. And by the way, folks, welcome into Film and Whiskey. If this is your first episode here, welcome in. You came for a freaking banger because I love Skyfall. But what we do on this show is we talk about movies and we drink whiskey. This season, we are looking at films that came out in the last 20 years, and we're asking, does this film deserve to be considered a modern classic? Skyfall is a really interesting one to talk about, Brad, for all of the reasons that we've already mentioned. But getting back to my point, third film in the Bond franchise out of, I believe, 27 now, 28 maybe. And we started with Casino Royale. We then went back last season and looked at, I keep saying Goldfinger. It's not Goldfinger. GoldenEye from the 1990s. And now we're coming back into the Craig era for Skyfall. And I'm sure that much of our conversation today is going to focus on the comparisons and contrasting elements between Casino Royale and Skyfall. These are the two crown jewels of the Daniel Craig era. He was in 5 Bond films, and I would dare say that these are the only 2 that are worth talking about. So he batted 40%, which is, 400 is a great batting average in baseball. I don't know about in movies. But it also might be the case that these are 2 of the 3 best Bond movies ever made.
Yeah, when you look back at the history of the Daniel Craig Bond films, I feel like the quality of Casino Royale and Skyfall kind of overshadows the rest. Mm-hmm. But for me, I have a distinct memory of I went to see all of the Daniel Craig Bonds in theaters, probably through Spectre, the one following this. And I just remember the 2 in between Casino and Skyfall. I think it's Quantum of Solace, and
there was only one. It was just Quantum of Solace, then Skyfall, then Spectre.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, then Quantum of Solace really sucked because I remember thinking, I was like, oh, wow, Casino Royale was a banger, and I might not ever go see another Bond movie. After watching Quantum of Solace, I thought it was so bad.
Well, let's put a pin in that because we've touched on a few different topics that I think we really need to hit on to contextualize this movie. But before we get too far down the rabbit trail, it's time for our first segment of the day, which we call Brad Explains.
Brad's gonna give us the movie plot with only 60 seconds ticking on the clock. So let's go ahead and hear your take with this little segment that we call Brad Explains.
Brad Explains is the part of the show where Brad breaks down the plot of the film that we have just seen, often for the first time. Brad, this is clearly not your first time with Skyfall. You apparently saw it in the theater. Have you watched it in the interim, in the intervening 12 years?
I don't think I have. Wow. I think this is my second time with the film.
Along with Casino Royale and a couple others, this is maybe the most compulsively rewatchable Bond. It's very weighty and very heavy. But I think the action set pieces are so well constructed, and it's such a beautiful movie to look at, that I've caught myself many times, flipping through channels and Skyfall's on, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to watch it till that subway train crashes through the roof, because that just sounds like a good way to spend the next 25 minutes,
Yeah, I found myself forgetting most of this movie. There was so much of this film that I'm like, oh yeah, there's a Komodo dragon. I forgot about that. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, there's a trash island. I forgot about that. There was a lot of this film that I did not remember, and I was mostly happy to return to.
I think that Skyfall was so beloved by critics, and it made so much money, that I don't want to say there was a backlash afterwards, but, maybe 5 years on, people started to really say, Skyfall was good, but it didn't feel like a Bond movie to me. I like Casino Royale better. And what I have found to be anecdotally true is that people haven't gone back and watched Skyfall a lot. And when they do, what they realize is kind of similar to your experience. There are a number of moments and scenes that are embedded into your James Bond memories. And you forget that they all come from this movie. I think when you add up the sum total of Bond on the floating raft in that navy blue tuxedo, the Komodo dragon, the fight where they're all in silhouette. Everything in this movie that you remember, once it comes up in the movie, you're like, oh, this is in Skyfall too? That's crazy. I could have swore this was in some other movie. So anyway, all that to say, I'm very pumped to talk about the iconic moments in this movie. but we have to get the plot out of the way. So folks, if you have not seen Skyfall, I would highly recommend you go watch it. Hit pause here. Come back and join us in 60 seconds after Brad spoils the hell out of it. Brad, you have 1 minute on the clock, and go.
Skyfall is a film about the latest exploits of the famed agent 007. Bond's latest mission goes wrong, and the list of names, if you've ever seen the first Mission Impossible, it's the exact same plot. The list of names of a lot of agents across the world is stolen and eventually exposed. M is forced to face a political inquiry into her leadership as Bond goes on the hunt for the mysterious rogue agent who has stolen the list. They find each other, get into lots of fights, blow a lot of things up, return to Bond's childhood home, and at the end of the film, M, played by the famed Dame Judi Dench, dies.
But she's replaced by the famed Ralph Fiennes. So,
Would you make that trade?
I wouldn't say it's an upgrade, but it's definitely like a lateral move. And I think that's
sure
saying a lot, honestly, because Judi Dench is so good as M.
Oh, she's incredible, man.
We have a lot of places to go today. Brad, you've done a great job of encapsulating this movie very succinctly. I kind of want to start by framing this movie in the context of the Bond franchise. So this is like the 23rd, I think, movie in the Bond franchise. It marked the 50th anniversary of the franchise, and the third movie in the Craig era. Now, the Craig era kicked off with a sort of, we're doing a gritty reboot thing. If you remember the first part of Casino Royale, where it's all black and white, and, Daniel Craig looks nothing like the Bonds that have come before, they're definitely leaning into, and I'm sure we talked about this in the Casino Royale episode, the Jason Bourne-ification of action films and kind of stripping Bond back down to a more hand-to-hand combat, realistic, grounded, quote-unquote Bond.
Mm-hmm.
They do Casino Royale. It works really well. They give the sequel movie Quantum of Solace to this director, Mark Forster. It gets horrific reviews and no one likes it. And so now they're back to the drawing board with Craig as Bond. And it kind of seems like this movie, Brad, and you've hinted at it, aside from just trying to reestablish Bond as culturally relevant, they wanted to make this movie kind of the biggest and best Bond ever in terms of what it wants to tackle narratively, the inner psychology of Bond, but also grappling with Bond's own place in the culture and reminiscing on 50 years of Bond lore. And it's trying to do a lot here. And I think in order to do that, the studio and the people that hold the rights to the Bond franchise went back to the drawing board very similarly to the 2004 U.S. men's national basketball team only won bronze. This is an embarrassment on an international level. We need to get our shit together. And then in 2008, they came back with a super team. You know what I mean? It kind of feels like we're going to get Oscar-winning director Sam Mendes. We're going to bring on his collaborative composer, Thomas Newman. We're going to let Roger Deakins film the thing. And we're going to go big this time. We're going to get an Oscar winner in Javier Bardem to play the big bad. They stacked the deck for this one. And I don't think that when you're just watching this movie in a vacuum, that it quite sinks in exactly how much they were pushing all their chips in on this movie.
Yeah. And can I just say, the horns in this film are incredible. At multiple points throughout the movie, whether it's Javier Bardem's entrance from a mile away, like it's Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the horns during that sequence are incredible. When M is I think it's right after Bardem dies at the end of the film, they just have these really beautiful, soft French horns just leading the way into her death. I don't know why, but for some reason, there were multiple points throughout the film where I was just like, man, this score is awesome.
You know what? It's funny because Thomas Newman, we've talked about him quite a few times on the podcast. He's a very prolific composer. His particular style doesn't always jive with me, and he likes to use really unique instruments in the background. And I was actually, just before we jumped on, Brad, I was Googling what are the unique instruments that Thomas Newman uses, and he likes to use the hammered dulcimer a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with this instrument, but it's like...
Don't get me started on the hammered dulcimer, Bob.
Underneath a lot of his music, you'll hear that like ding, 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 and then it sounds just like that in some of the action sequences in this movie. And I didn't even realize, I didn't look up the composer, but I'm watching this and I'm like, oh, that's Thomas Newman. They let Thomas Newman do a James Bond movie. To your point, though, like when it matters, the guy does nail it. And I think it kind of contributes again to, we don't just want to reestablish Bond as the preeminent action franchise, but we want this to be really taken seriously as a work of cinema. And I will say, this really is the first time that James Bond is given like awards recognition or at least consideration, right? And I think it kind of starts, if we can get into the cast a little bit, with Judi Dench. This is Judi Dench's movie. Like, I think that she may not steal every scene and they may not always be giving her the meatiest stuff, but she's been a part of this franchise for, I think, 17 years at this point. And
I think her first film was
GoldenEye.
GoldenEye.
Yep.
Yeah. So we have now covered the extent of her career with as this role.
And she's ready to be done with this part. I don't blame her at this point. And so this is her send-off. This is her swan song. But thematically, narratively, everything is leading to Judi Dench as kind of this figure who is representative of old Britain. And so it's both the send-off for the character and the sort of rich metaphorical thing. I guess I'll start by talking about how I'm surprised they didn't push her harder for a supporting actress nomination, because it kind of seems like it's almost like with, Ian McKellen as Gandalf, or like, I don't know, Alan Rickman as Snape, or like some of these roles where it's like, did you really just not want to try to get them nominated? Because it seems like you set up the entire movie for this to be their shining moment, and then you really fumbled the bag at the end here.
Well, and didn't fumble the bag cinematically.
No.
To be clear, like they fumbled the bag in not even marketing, but just pushing for them to be nominated, which even that feels a little weird. Like, I feel like as a common person looking at it, you're like, oh, I thought that all the people are just supposed to watch the movies and decide who's best.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it shouldn't have to involve Harvey Weinstein being sleazy and marketing his people. But I think when you look at Dench in this movie, the reason she shines so much is because she has this ability to convey the lack of professionalism that she has when it comes to Bond under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she truly views him as a son, as someone that she cares about. And I think that when you look at Javier Bardem as the villain of this film, the way he continues to call her mother and act as if she had betrayed him, like, you find yourself drawn into this web of, is she just a professional, cold-hearted, I don't care about my agents, or does she actually care about Bond? And like, that's at the absolute heart of this, is, as an audience, should we care about the person of James Bond or not?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've had him for 50 years. Is he a character worth our emotional attachment or not? And Dench is the audience stand-in in that way.
Oh, that's really a good way of thinking about it. I actually didn't put that together until now, because I was taking the reading on this movie, and I'll make a few more references to this, but if we talk about the Jason Bourne-ification of action movies, then we also have to talk about the really long shadow that was cast by The Dark Knight. I think The Dark Knight is an influence that's all over this movie, especially because when The Dark Knight hits theaters in 2008, it obviously wasn't the first time that you had a villain who was espousing a philosophy, and the philosophy makes sense. And so as an audience member, you're kind of torn between, this guy is making a whole lot of sense, but I know he's bad. It's not the first time that was done, but I think it really reestablished this emphasis on villains who don't just muscle their way around, but they're like thinking man's villains. And that really comes to fruition here in Skyfall. If we want to dive into Bardem a little bit, I think they do a great job with his character. The point I was going to make was, in The Dark Knight, we had that long talk about like the Patriot Act and how people accuse that movie of like, supporting surveillance states and everything else. I think if there's any movie that you could really make that argument with, it's kind of Skyfall, because like the entire Judi Dench character is kind of a stand-in for like the old way of doing things as a nation and how we still need it. And like this movie is proof that we still need it. I kept looking at it that way. I didn't put it together that she is the audience surrogate. And the question that's being asked of us is like, does James Bond still matter?
Mm-hmm.
So well done.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I keep thinking that you're going to like go into something and then you're just not.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to bask in the glory that you have given me.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, then let's dive into Javier Bardem, who is just having a hell of a good time with this role. Like he is hamming it up like crazy, which is what a Bond villain should do. Like he comes in with his fake ass blonde hair and that light colored sport coat, and is just flamboyant, and he's touching all over Bond, and he's playing with him, and he does the little playful face that he does in No Country for Old Men a couple times, and you're like, oh, it just works, man. I don't know what else to say.
I did not like Javier Bardem in this movie.
No, Brad, come on, dude.
I was like, he is so extra. If I'm allowed to use that word, I know I'm getting older. I could not take it. And I'm with you. Like, Bond villains are supposed to be extra. But the rest of the film is so serious and sexy and, like, worried about the future and who we are. And then Javier Bardem, like, slides his way into the movie. And it just felt terrible. And I will say, he got better as it went along. I think by the end of the film, I loved his character. But the first shot of him walking in from the elevator felt like it was a Monty Python skit.
You don't like that monologue about the rats eating each other?
Oh,
dude, it's so
cheesy.
It's so good, dude.
Oh,
now they don't have a taste for coconut. Now they only eat rat. I was like, hell yeah.
I couldn't take it, dude. He is so hammy and so ridiculous. I
am so convinced of your wrongness that I'm not even going to engage with it.
Okay,
but I do think this is a good jumping off point to talk about kind of this movie in particular, but also the Craig era, and how I think one of the big flaws of the Craig era was that their emphasis on quote unquote stripped down Bond meant that they had to reckon with the past of Bond and how Bond is undeniably cheesy in some, like, you know, there's movies where James Bond goes to space. You're looking at like Q making him gadgets. And so their response in this movie is like, no gadgets. It's a radio and a gun. And that's all you get, James Bond. And I do think that that's kind of why people go back to Casino Royale, because it had a little bit more Bondiness to it. But I do feel like if you're gonna do a serious Bond, this movie is kind of the ideal for that, because Bond still gets, 20 one-liners in this movie. Albert Finney as the caretaker gets some jokes. Judi Dench gets some jokes. Javier Bardem gets jokes. And I think the humor, it works in terms of like alleviating tension. And I think they do a much better job. It sounds like you never saw the last Craig movie, which is called No Time to Die.
I did not.
That movie is a mess, bro. First of all, the Bond villain is Rami Malek. Enough said.
I thought it was Christoph Waltz.
No, Christoph Waltz is Inspector, and he makes a brief appearance in No Time to Die, but the main bad guy is played by Rami Malek.
Gotcha.
And they try to do both, where they make it even more serious than Skyfall, but then they try to bring back really cheesy gadgets and like sight gags, and they throw it into a 3-hour movie, and it's like there is no direction here.
Does Malek have like big fake teeth to mess with the way he talks?
It's just Malek dressed like Freddie Mercury. He just comes out in like a unitard. And it's the same shot of like Javier Bardem, but Rami Malek pops out and just raises his fist and goes, "Hey-oh!" Waits for James Bond to respond.
somehow Bond becomes the music producer that like tries to shoot them down.
Nobody will listen to Bohemian Rhapsody. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts. This is a good place to start comparing Casino Royale and Skyfall. But before we get into the meat of that, do you see that as kind of a flaw of the Bond era? And do you think this movie addresses it in a satisfactory way?
No, I think that this film is too on the nose about certain elements of the Bond past and like is just snooty about it. Like the way that Q says like this is all you need. Like I think what it did for me was it pushed things so far into the realistic sense that my brain went to like, oh, so you're going to put a fingerprint sensor on a gun and think that's going to work every time? Like, what if he shoots with his other hand? What if something happens and like the thing stops working? Like, there's so many things that could go wrong with that it's like, okay, you want me to be realistic? I'm going to think about this as realistically as possible and say, this is really dumb and it wouldn't work. And so they were so on the nose about certain elements of the Bond history and how they were throwing it out that it just took me out of the film and took me out of where they were at. Like, allow the audience to be smart and like understand where you're going with the film. Like, we're trying to be more realistic, so there's less gadgets. Like, don't say that out loud.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet, I do feel like it. You're kind of between a rock and a hard place. If this is the direction you're going with the series, then you're left with the options of either stick to your guns and be stripped down, Bond, or try to shoehorn in gadgets and stuff. And, you know, man, I wish you had seen No Time to Die, because I think that's a really good comparison point. I do appreciate that, at least for this one film, they stuck to their guns. But I think that it makes this movie, for me, Brad, I really love this movie. Like, I think I'm going to give this a very, very high score.
Ooh.
And I think that this might be the best made movie in the Bond franchise. And it might not be particularly close. But I don't know that I would call it the best Bond movie. If someone's asking, like, what's a James Bond movie, I don't think I'd point them to Skyfall. Like, Casino Royale clears this by a lot, if you're just talking sheer Bondiness.
Yeah, and I would say that Casino Royale is the perfect mixture of high-quality filmmaking paired with the Bondiness of it all. Mm-hmm. I think that Skyfall leans into, we're going to get away from the Bondiness and make a high-quality film, and I think they do succeed in that. The cinematography in this it's Deakin. Like, it's so freaking good. And there's so many memorable sequences, and the music is incredible, and I'm with you that this is an incredibly well-made film, but there are definitely moments that I go, oh, you're going a little over the top here with what you're shooting for, whether it's Bardem's character or the gadgets or even some of the jokes, like when Bardem looks at Bond from the ladder and goes, I got a radio too. Beep, this is for you. Hee hee.
I liked it.
I hated that.
Do you know why I liked it?
Why'd you like that,
Because
Bob?
a train comes through the roof. That is what I've seen this movie, I don't know, 5 times probably. And I you know what's coming. And I'm watching it, I'm sitting on my couch, and I just leaned back and like put my hands behind my head like a satisfied dad. Like, it was just like, this is what movies were made for, was this practically done effect of a subway train crashing through the roof of something. When have you ever seen that before? It's so cool.
I think it looks really cheesy, and it makes me...
Oh my gosh, dude.
They play up this villain as this like super genius who is a better agent than anyone else. And yet, somehow he knows that he's going to be running away from Bond at this exact moment, at this exact time. He's going to get shot at. He's going to pause on the ladder for just long enough to go, hee hee, radio bomb. Haha, watch the train come. Like that, like it's so far beyond any capability of believability that I just kind of go, okay, sure.
Isn't it funny how some films we're willing to suspend our disbelief for and some we're not? And I don't know that I could ever provide a satisfactory answer to why I don't care about that. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
I think maybe it's the payoff. Maybe it's just like because it is something that is so cinematic that I've never seen before that I'm like, yeah, of course he would have no idea at exactly the time Q accidentally let him into the mainframe and then this, like he couldn't time that up with a train. And yet I'm not thinking about that at all in that sequence. And it's just funny to me that you are. And I think maybe it's a sign that you just weren't as bought into what led up to that. And so your mind is wandering to like the logic of it all.
Yeah.
It's just so funny that like there's some movies where I'm in your chair and I'm like, I was thinking about the logic. And you're like, dude, just enjoy the movie.
Yeah,
and I feel like I'm in that point.
I'm sitting here going, could I have gotten like 5 more minutes of backstory on Javier Bardem? That would have been great.
Shut up, dude.
Here's the thing. They make the movie so serious and real and gritty that when it's not, it's so noticeable to me. I think that's the problem, is that Casino Royale stays within the ridiculousness of it a little bit, that I never get thrown off. This one is just more tonally
See, and
off.
I do think that this movie feels like an outlier in the Bond universe. I hate using the word universe, but you know what I mean.
The Bondiverse.
the Bondiverse. Because it really does play like a thriller movie that just happens to have James Bond in it. Like it's a really well-made action thriller. And you can almost forget that it's a Bond movie for large chunks of it. And I think for a lot of people, that's kind of a non-starter, right? Like if you're going to make my Bond movie not Bondy, then it's not a good Bond movie. And I understand that point of view. I think for me, it was just like, I got so caught up in how well made of an action thriller it was that those callbacks to other Bondy things, like the Aston Martin showing up, it was just enough fan service that I felt like they were kind of keeping people who were starting to wander on board. And so for me, it worked. It sounds like it didn't work to the same extent for you, Brad. But I think that one area where we might be in agreement, and we should hit on this really quick before we go to break, is the inclusion of Ralph Fiennes as some government guy named Mallory.
Yes. Government guy number 37.
Yeah, who then becomes M at the end of the film. And I think that even more than any performance he gives, it is inspired casting because this is, for such a huge chunk of the movie, this is a who is the bad guy and how do we find him out? And then having Voldemort and, Amon Girth from Schindler's List come into your movie as new government guy, it does such a good job of not throwing you off the scent, but like even after Javier Bardem is caught and apprehended and like sitting in the basement, you have this moment where like he escapes and then Q is talking to the, M's sidekick guy about like, how do we hide this breadcrumb trail? And he's saying like, we have to make it not so obvious that he doesn't smell a rat. And right when he says that, Ralph Fiennes walks in the back of the room. And it's just enough to make you wonder like, oh no, like, is this also a bad guy? And I think just having that extra 30 seconds of like making the audience feel a sense of unease is exactly why you cast Ralph Fiennes in this role.
100%. To get to more of the script choice, I also found myself wondering if Naomi Harris, who plays the other agent who accidentally shot Bond, I think her name is Eve in the movie, like, she feels like she could also be the villain throughout the entire film, or at least the informant, the mole. And I think they do an excellent job with both of those characters of leaving them mysterious enough to wonder if they are good or bad. And it's not until Ralph Fiennes is in the room shooting at Javier Bardem that you're like, okay, this guy's legit. He's on the good guy side, and I like him.
Yeah, man.
And I gotta say, it's fun to have Ralph Fiennes in a role where I want to like him as an audience member, and not just as somebody who likes movies and is like, wow, what a great bad guy.
Yeah, exactly. All right, man, I think we're in a good spot to hit pause. I am really, really excited about the whiskey we chose today. So what do you say we get into drinking some very expensive, very well-aged Scotch?
You literally could say that sentence to me any moment of any day, and I would be in.
All right, today we are checking out Bowmore 22-year single malt Islay Scotch whiskey. This is made in collaboration with a little brand that you may have heard of if you're a fan of the James Bond franchise, Aston Martin.
Ooh.
So it's a co-branded venture, and this is, I mean, Brad, in the movie, they drink 50-year-old Macallan. In lieu of that, I think maybe we picked the perfect whiskey for this episode.
Correction, Daniel Craig drinks 50-year-old Macallan, and Javier Bardem wastes 50-year-old Macallan.
He does.
It's really disappointing.
Well, you know what we're not going to waste today is 22-year-old Bowmore Aston Martin Scotch. We have never tried a product from Bowmore before. I'm very excited. This is part of their Masters Selection series. I believe this was the third one to come out in that series. It says that it is double matured in specially chosen European oak and Oloroso sherry casks. It clocks in at 51% ABV or 102 proof, which means it's on the higher end of the proof spectrum for what we've tried from Islay Scotches, Brad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it 100% is. And I've said this before about Scotch in general. They actually do have a lot of Scotch above 100 proof, and it is delicious. So I am so excited to not just try something above 100 proof today, but something that is very well aged.
So they don't really go into any amount of detail that I can find about the aging process. It says aged 22 years in that combination of bourbon and sherry casks, but we don't know if it was like aged for 19 of those years in bourbon and then in sherry, or if they're just combining two different batches. No idea. All we really know is this is very old. It was put in casks in, I believe, 2000, bottled in 2022. Brad, I am freaking excited. Let's get into it.
The nose on this is absolutely gorgeous, Bob. There is pine cones and citrus. It's really like a nice grapefruit note for me. Mm-hmm. There is honey. There's saline. It's really lightly peated, in my opinion. And the more time I spent with it, the more I got like a really nice, fresh vanilla note that I thought was incredible. This is a 9.5 out of 10 for me, Bob.
I have absolutely nothing to add. Those are perfect nosing notes, Brad. I am also at a 9.5. I think this is I haven't tasted it yet, but just from a nosing perspective, this is a perfect like intro to peated Scotch, because it has all of the notes that you and I really love on our Highland Scotches, and then it adds just a little bit of peat to it. And I think this is perfect, dude. Now, I will say, on the note of Bond being from Scotland, apparently Ian Fleming liked Sean Connery so much that then he went back and wrote into the lore that Bond was Scottish, and the location that they use in this movie for Bond's home, Skyfall, is in Glencoe, Scotland, which is in the Highlands. So this is, we're looking at an Islay Scotch today. I'm just really glad that we have some connection, not just to the James Bond franchise, but also it reminds me a little bit of a Highland Scotch on the nose. So I like it a lot, man. I'm tasting it now. Brad, why don't you give us your tasting notes?
Dude, the first word I wrote down before I wrote anything else, this Scotch is idyllic. It is like a honey roasted almond. There's a lot of like really nice cigar flavors. There's orange peel. It gets decently peaty from what I got on the nose. And there's a little bit of a grapiness to it that just came through to kind of give you a bit of sweetness. I think this is a perfect Scotch, Bob. I think this is a 10 out of 10. Incredible palate. I would happily buy a bottle of this.
Dude, you are on point with these tasting notes today. Cigar smoke is a perfect note on the front of the palate. The peat doesn't really come in until the very back of the palate. But in between that, The second you said orange peel, I'm thinking orange zest.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that citrus note, as it starts to carry to the back of your palate, it becomes a little bit more grapefruity. Not the bitterness of grapefruit, but it reminded me of like a ruby red grapefruit. Really, really nice, man. And again, yeah, the peat's there, but it's not paired with those sort of bitter medicinal notes that you sometimes get on peated Scotch. Again, I think this is almost a platonic ideal of what Scotch can be, but it would also be maybe the best thing we've ever had to introduce somebody to peated Scotch, because there's no offensiveness to the peat here. It is a 10 out of 10 on the palate. I'd love to hear your finish notes because you're freaking knocking it out of the park so far, man.
I think on the finish, you were talking about the medicinal. It barely gets into medicinal for me. Have you ever like smelt or tasted rosehip?
Mm-mm.
It's got a little bit of a rosehip vibe for me, which is almost like an autumn leafy, herbal-y type of note. There's the saline really comes through strong on the finish. It turns into the meatiness I often like in Scotch, almost like a prosciutto. And the cigar smoke finally like lands in a peaty location once you're done drinking it, and that finish is just lingering there. I think that this is nearly a perfect finish. I'm going to give it a 9.5.
I'm going to come down to a 9. I just had my second sip of it, and I really liked the finish on the first sip. And this is one of the rare whiskeys where once my palate acclimates to it, I actually think the finish is more bitter the second time around. I actually got like bitter herbal notes on the very, very back of my palate on the finish here. And so it probably is the weakest part of the experience for me, but it's the difference between a 10, a 9.5, and a 9. So
yeah,
I'm at a 9 on the finish. On balance, I'm going to give this a 9.5. I thought about a 10. That second sip, the finish is just a little bit too bitter to justify a 10 for me, but I'd love to hear where you're at, Brad.
I'm at a 10 out of 10 on balance. I think that this brings a complexity of an experience that you need from a luxury whiskey. And the complexity is a lot of really great flavors that work incredibly well together. Mm-hmm. So this is an ideal balanced whiskey, like when I think about what we want in the realm of balance. And I think that when we're talking about a luxury whiskey, now, we brought the luxury category on so that we could talk about whiskeys that are so highly priced, you only go after them if you know what you're getting into. And I think it was helpful because it's hard sometimes to say, like, what's the difference between a $350 whiskey and a $700 whiskey? Mm-hmm. It's just difficult to quantify that sometimes. Whereas the difference between a $30 whiskey and a $70 whiskey, it feels a little more obvious. I think that in the category of luxury, and it looks like I could find this online for like $350 to $500. I think that this is a 9 out of 10, Bob.
Okay, so what I'm seeing online, Brad, is that they've released 3 versions of the Aston Martin. And this is it says 2023 on the label, but then I'm looking at the bottles and the label of the sample that we have matches up with the Aston Martin release number 2. So I just want to get that out there because if you go by the third batch or the first batch, that might not be what we're trying today. Again, that's just the downside of trying one in a range of things. But I'm finding the batch 2, like I'm on a website right now that's selling it for $450. I saw it for as much as $650. This is the first time that I've been like, you know what? Yeah. If I had $500 laying around and a bottle of this came up for sale, I would strongly consider not fixing something around my house to buy a bottle of this. Brad, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10, which is taking me to one of my highest scores in the history of this podcast. I'm at a 47 out of 50, Brad.
I'm a 1 point higher than you difference. I'm at a 48 out of 50, Bob.
This might be the highest scored whiskey we've ever tried, Brad.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, I was not expecting this today. I thought it would be a good whiskey.
Yeah.
Wow. We're at a 47.5 on average, or a 95 out of 100, Brad.
Oh, we've definitely never hit 95 on our average.
This is insane.
It's so good, dude.
Oh my God.
I am so disappointed that we don't have more of this to drink. Because, man, oh man, now I will say, this is better than Lagavulin 16, but I think Lagavulin 16 is close enough in quality to this that for $105, I feel justified in my choice to keep that on my shelf at all times.
The thing I like about this is that there's a softness and a subtleness to it that I think sometimes peated Scotch overwhelms the ability to pick up some of those softer notes on something. And this still carries, like, I'm getting notes of strawberry still on the finish. I'm getting some melon here. Like, it's really softly peated, but in a way that I think everything complements each other to an extent that I've never had in a peated whiskey. And that is something to really celebrate here.
Yeah, this is a whiskey, you're right, Bob, to be celebrated. Bowmore, if you want to send us more of this, we will happily grovel at your feet because it is incredible.
Brad, we have a little bit more to talk about with the movie Skyfall, so what do you say we get back into that?
Let's get to it, Bob. All right, everybody. That was Bowmore Masters Selection, Aston Martin 22 year. We believe it's the second edition of that lineup. And I'll just say this. I am like 99% sure it is the highest combined rated whiskey we have ever done on this podcast.
Yes. And I am going to be emailing them and tweeting at them and everything I can do. To try to figure out, is this the batch 2? And then B, how do we get on your distribution list for every year that I'll do a Bond movie every year when this comes out.
Yeah,
if we compare it with this whiskey.
Yeah, we just need to find a holiday that makes sense with it. We'll have our Thanksgiving, Christmas, and whatever we come up with for Bond, because Bowmore is incredible. Dude, we need to drink more Bowmore.
Fantastic, dude. All right, Brad. I'm coming off a loss last week in our next game, which we call 2 Facts and a Falsehood.
Brad is gonna try to stump you, Bob, to all right and what is wrong. 2 facts and a falsehood.
2 Facts and a Falsehood is the part of the show where Brad presents me with 3 items as fact about the making of this movie, and I have to guess which one is the falsehood. Now, I started the season 5-0, and last week I knew I was going to get it wrong no matter what I picked, and that self-fulfilling prophecy came true.
You were so confident in it that, like, I feel personally like you are threatening the integrity of the game. I think you threw last week, Bob.
I didn't throw last week, but I can't trust you. And you were like, dude, you know you can change your answer. And as soon as you said that, I was like, you're playing 3D chess with my mind now. I don't know. I know I can change it, but once you start imploring me to change it, I'm like, do you feel pity for me as a friend, or are you just trying to get the win here?
I'm trying to prop you up as much as you can, Bob, with like meaningless things. This is basically, what is it? Whose line is it anyways?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm 5-1 on the season. I did very little research into the background of this film. So, Brad, you are ripe for another win this week. Hit me with your 2 facts and a falsehood.
Fact number 1, the script supervisor had a difficult time with continuity in some scenes, especially in M's first meeting with Mallory, as her bag kept disappearing and reappearing in cuts from Dench to Fiennes. Fact number 2, Dame Judi Dench played the role of M in this movie at the age of 77, which also coincided with it being her 7th appearance in the role of M. Fact number 3, in the 50 years of Bond films history up until this point, Daniel Craig is the first 007 to ever be shown actually being shot in the line of duty.
Interesting. Number 2 sounds like it's the most plausible one. I'm not sure if she was 77. You may be making that number up, but I'm counting GoldenEye.
She was 77 and a half.
GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, Die Another Day, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall. It's definitely her 7th appearance. So I'm going to just, for now, assume that's true. Has James Bond been shot before? I have to imagine that he has. My guy could take a bullet in the shoulder if he needed to.
I mean, in this movie, he does.
Huh. And then does the bag keep disappearing? That sounds like I think my gut is telling me 3 is the falsehood. And if I overthink this and drag it out, it's going to be boring audio. So I think for the sake of brevity and just being as confident as James Bond when you're gambling, I'm going to say 3 is the falsehood.
Now, Bob, if I invite you to change your answer this time, is that like encouraging you to do it since it discouraged you last time? Where are you at on the mind games?
We're not even going to entertain that. We're just going to go with the gut today and say 3 is the falsehood.
Final answer?
Final answer.
Final answer is correct.
Yeah. All right. Now, did you do any amount of research into when he has been shot?
Yes. This was the second time he has ever been shot. The first time was in Thunderball. So it was a rare thing to happen in the movies, but this was the second time he had ever been shot.
The amount of times people have shot at James Bond with machine guns, for him to never get shot is seriously impressive.
Yeah, it's a suspension of disbelief, Bob.
All right, man. So I am back in the win column. I'm 6-1 on the season. Feeling pretty good about that one, Brad.
Yeah, I'm very happy for you, Robert.
All right, let's talk about some things in this movie that Bob Book really liked. And I'll say this because I feel like you're going to be with me on this one, Brad.
Yeah.
I love a movie where the characters have to fortify a building and make their last stand. There's something about last stand movies that just appeal to me as a dude.
Yeah. When Judi Dench is like building plastic bag nail bombs, it's freaking cool. Like there's no other way around it. There's limited resources and lots of bad guys, and we got to figure this out. And I'm just like, it's like every little boy's like play session in the woods where you're just like, we have to win and we have no chance of doing it. Let's freaking go.
And this is what the montage was invented for. It's like cheesy rom-com girl trying things on in the mirror or dudes fortifying a building, because like those are the only two things you ever need, or Rocky training to fight somebody. Those are the 3 uses for the cinematic montage. And it just works so good because then you get that shot of like Bond going back inside and giving one last look to the outside before he locks himself in. And then you have the calm before the storm conversation with Judi Dench. And it has that feel and that tension that you get with, on a much larger scale, a movie like The Two Towers when you're waiting on Helm's Deep to start. I couldn't make it any farther in the episode without talking about a good fortification movie, you know?
Yeah. I have a public service announcement. Sylvester Stallone with a beard is incredible. Like,
really good.
Just stupendous. Daniel Craig with a beard, a little less impressive in this movie.
Does he have a beard? I mean, he has some stubble, right?
Yeah, it's like stubble, but it's like enough that you're like, oh, I don't know if Daniel Craig can actually grow a beard.
I think that there's very different uses of facial hair going on. Like one is to make him look like a haunted, disheveled man. Whereas Rocky's beard is like, this beard is evidence that I conquered a mountain.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
100%.
Like, I need to see Craig with mountain man beard to know if it's good or not.
Yeah. If like by the end of the film, he had a giant mountain man beard and a Scottish accent as he was defending the house, I think I would have been a little more bought in on the beard. But you are right, Bob. The fortification scene freaking rocks. And it's the only thing I truly remembered from this film 12 years after watching it.
That's crazy. So I feel like some of the more, I keep using the word iconic. I don't want to make it sound like this is the biggest cultural movie ever. But when I say iconic, like the iconography of this movie, the memorable shots that are purposely inserted into this movie. I remember a lot of conversation happening around some of these. And, you know, for a guy that used to read GQ, this movie is where Tom Ford puts Daniel Craig in a midnight blue shawl collar tuxedo. And it was like The Devil Wears Prada. You know that scene in The Devil Wears Prada where Anne Hathaway's like, I don't even need you guys. And then Meryl Streep's like, that blue sweater you're wearing is the result of like 10 years of fashion progress until you found it in a bargain. It's like that. Like that blue tuxedo.
I tell you something, Bob?
Go ahead.
I think that's the dumbest scene in the world.
I mean, it's true, though. It's a good encapsulation of how the fashion industry works.
Yeah, I also think it's really dumb.
I'm not arguing with that. I just want to say that tuxedo, like, set the fashion world on fire for a long, long time. And so, like, that is maybe the most iconic Bond outfit of the last, I don't know, 50 years. So, like, the stuff like that, I think this movie did a really good job of becoming, like, having tentacles that went outside of just good action movie. This is the first Bond movie.
Tentacles, huh?
Yeah. This is the first Bond movie that hit $1 billion at the worldwide box office. That had never been done before. Like, this was truly something caught on here with this movie that I don't know if we give enough credit to now. And maybe it's because there's been 2 mediocre Daniel Craig movies that came after it. But this one, everybody saw this movie the year it came out.
Yeah, this really was a cultural icon for a time. I will say, I don't know if I've ever thought of the Bond suits as like something to take note of. I know that they have been a big deal in the world of fashion. I think if anything, I'm just proving in this episode that I don't give a freaking rip about fashion. Like, Bond looks cool, neat.
We know. Besides that, though, like I said, they tried to stack the deck in terms of the cast, the crew. They also got Adele the year after she comes out with 21 and sets the world on fire with Rolling in the Deep. It becomes one of the best-selling albums in history. And they get Adele to sing the song Skyfall, which is at the same time not a good song. And also there's like 2 lines in the song that everybody remembers, like, let the sky fall. Like, there's just something about the hummability of that one little part of the song that it's like, is this one of the best Bond songs? And I don't know, it's because so I don't think it's when you just sit and listen to it, I don't think it's a very good song, but it's also, it feels like a Bond song.
It has the weightiness that Adele brings to a song, and I think that's what makes it such a good Bond song, is that she just has that huskiness and depth and like epicness that you're like, oh yeah, man, I'm watching James Bond.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's aided by the fact that the Bond franchise, to its credit, has really stuck to its guns on having the opening credit sequence where there's just silhouettes of naked women and then like ominous imagery of like things that might happen in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that the Craig series is the apex of the opening scene, or like the opening titles in the Bond universe, because even when you watch like a Pierce Brosnan Bond movie, they're lighthearted and cheesy enough that, yeah, they're showing you like clips of things that are going to come up in the movie, but it never feels like foreshadowing. Whereas I feel like because these movies are more serious, you're seeing these images on screen of things Bond is going to encounter in this movie, and you're like, oh, this seems ominous.
I think that one of the best prop shots in any of the Bond movies is the like elk that is on top of the gate into his childhood home of Skyfall. It's just such a beautiful shot of a beautifully crafted item that its inclusion in the opening sequence was just so cool.
All right, Brad, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And we're going to zoom out and just talk about life here for a minute. This movie came out 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Which, first of all, that flew by, because this feels like it's a recent movie, and it's not anymore. It's 12 years old. It feels like a movie from a different time, and I don't know how else to say it. Like, at multiple points of the movie. Like, yes, it's Deakins. Yes, it's like I recognize all these actors. It felt it felt more akin to a 90s thriller than it does to a 2024 movie. And it made me very bummed out that like we don't really get movies like this anymore. The closest thing we're getting is the Mission Impossible franchise, which, to its credit, also has the opening title sequence. They know what they're doing. But it's because Tom Cruise is like so desperately trying to remind people of why movies like this work. And I spent a good portion of this movie like feeling old because everybody in this movie looks so much younger. I couldn't believe these last 12 years have aged these people a lot. Like Judi Dench is already 77, and I'm like, wow, she looks like a spring chicken, you know? And like Ralph Fiennes still looks like he has the youthfulness that he doesn't have anymore. And I was reckoning with how long it's been since this had come out, but also how far cinema has strayed from this model in just 12 years, that this feels like a relic.
Dude, I said that this was an introspective movie on the world of secret agents, espionage, and aging.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I said that for a reason. I think that this movie is freaking sad, especially now that we're watching it in 2024, and it already feels like a Inception level dream within a dream, like a movie about aging that has already aged. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, it is so hard to sit down and watch this movie and reckon with the fact that we all have to face ourselves with that question that M and Bond find themselves asking throughout the movie and answering, is like, what do we actually care about in this world? Like, in a place where we feel like things are often life or death, and we have all these big questions about the world. And like, to be honest, I think this episode is coming out sometime around a week or two after the election, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like, we are asking big questions about what we want for the future of our country and the future of the world. We all have to reckon with the fact that it is the close relationships that we form over the years of our life, just as M and Bond have done in a professional setting. Like, those are the things that matter most. And are we going to be satisfied with them when we come to our deathbed, as Judi Dench does at the end of this movie, or not?
Mm-hmm.
And that's such an important question for us to ask. And I don't know if I expected to be asking that question at the end of a James Bond blow things up, you know, like room defense, awesome thing. Like, there's so much great stuff in this movie, and yet I didn't expect to find the heart of it to be such a basic, elemental question of humanity.
100%, man. Now, I think for us, we're going to reckon with, do those questions pan out, and does it work at what it's trying to do? But before we give it a final score and really evaluate it, it's time for our last segment of the day, which we call Let's Make It a Double, presented by Blackwood Distilling Company.
We're near the end of the episode, so thanks for listening to the Film and Whiskey Show. Let's pair another film with this one, even if it's a struggle. It's our final segment of the day, now let's make it a double.
Let's Make It a Double is the part of the show where we pick a movie to pair up with this one to make the perfect double feature. Brad, do you want to go first today, or do you want me to?
I think I could probably go first.
Let's do it.
I think that a perfect double feature for Skyfall would be Mission Impossible Fallout. I think that both films kind of capture the idea of an aging, you know, super spy that is trying to finish his one last mission. I think that there's a lot of really beautifully choreographed action scenes in both. I think the cinematography is great in both. I think that Craig is really awesome in his role. I think that Tom Cruise is the pinnacle of the super spy. Like, it would just be an absolute blast of an evening to watch these two films back to back.
Yeah, they really are like brothers as movies. They're all about, you know, reckoning with your own decisions and mistakes and regret. I'm trying to decide, like, which of these two movies do I think is better, because they're very different movies. But it's definitely the pinnacle of the Mission Impossible franchise. And in a lot of ways, I feel like this is the pinnacle of the Bond franchise. So yeah, great pairing, dude.
Thanks, man. Where are you going with your pairing for Let's Make It a Double?
You know, I had one that I'm still going to stick with it, but I was like, no one's going to see this coming. And then you named the movie like 5 minutes ago. So I'm going to pair this movie with Christopher Nolan's Inception. I saw Inception in the movie theater again earlier this year, and I feel like I forget how much that movie becomes about Leonardo DiCaprio's repressed memory and regret and how he keeps burying things deeper and deeper in his psyche and how it comes back to bite everybody. And the idea of hiding his wife inside of this mental castle that he's constructed for himself, where you have to go like way down the elevator to encounter his deep, dark secret. I was reminded of that in the sequence where Bond kidnaps M and is shuttling her off to a place no one would ever find me. And it's, you know, it's his past. It's the thing he misses the most. He regrets the most. His kind of rosebud is Skyfall. And I think that like Inception and Skyfall are both just freaking bangers. But I said that Dark Knight was a huge influence on this movie. I don't know if they did any tweaking to the script between the time Inception comes out in 2010 and the time this movie comes out in 2012. But I have a feeling that Inception is a little bit of an influence on this movie as well. So Inception is my choice. Mission Impossible Fallout is Brad's. Talk about three good movies, dude.
Also, fun fact, great usage of horns in Inception.
Do you think that like Hans Zimmer came in to meet with Nolan at one point and he's like, all right, I got it. I know the exact thing I'm going to build this around. He's like, oh yeah, what is that? And he just flips the laptop around and presses play and it's just that one note.
Yeah, he's like, D flat, my friend, D flat. What do you mean, Hans? It's just a note.
He's like, you'll see. They'll all see.
They'll all see.
Let's Make It a Double was presented by Blackwood Distilling Company. No matter what you choose to pair this movie with, you can always make it a double with Blackwood Distilling Co. And if you'd like to try Blackwood Distilling, what we'd like you to do is go to bourbonoutfitter.com/filmwhiskey. That's bourbonoutfitter/filmwhiskey. Use our code FILMWHISKEY with an E at checkout, and you will save 5% off of a bottle. Now, folks, 5% doesn't sound like a lot of money, but remember, Blackwood is a luxury product, and every dollar counts in this economy. We would love for you to check out Blackwood, especially that toasted rye, Brad. How freaking good is that stuff?
Yeah, you will not regret buying this bottle. I have been slowly working my way through my bottle, and it is incredible every single time through. So yeah, code FILMWHISKEY, bourbonoutfitters.com/filmwhiskey. You got to do both. So use the URL and the code to get 5% off your bottle of Blackwood. All right, dude, let's give Skyfall some final scores. You're clearly cooler on this movie than I am, so I will turn the floor over to you. Where are you coming out on Skyfall? And as you give your score, too, do you feel like you can evaluate this movie in a vacuum? Or are you always going to be comparing it against the rest of the Bond franchise and what expectations are for a Bond movie? Man, that is so tough because I truly, growing up, I remember like watching scenes or like half or a quarter of some of the old Sean Connery, what's his name? Roger
Moore.
Yeah, Roger Moore. Like, I remember seeing scenes from those. I don't know if I ever actually sat down and watched an entire one with my dad. So really, the Bond universe for me is Daniel Craig through and through. Like, I watched GoldenEye for the first time as like a 31-year-old for the podcast. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think that the Daniel Craig universe is the pinnacle of Bond, and it's what I think of when I think of Bond. I think that Skyfall is incredible. I still think I like Casino Royale more. I don't remember what I gave Casino Royale. I think it was like an 8.5 or a 9. I think that I'm at an 8 out of 10 on Skyfall. Like, beautiful film, really well choreographed fight scenes, a great score, some really engaging characters, But there are some major flaws, in my opinion, with the tonality of the film, the tonality of the villain. There's just too much going on that takes me out of the experience for me to be like 9 out of 10.
Brad, I'm going to give this movie a 9.5 out of 10. I am way higher on this than I remembered being. And I think for me, it was realizing halfway through that, yes, everyone's complaints about this not being a very Bondy Bond movie are true. But at what it is, which is a Oscar caliber action thriller, it's a freaking great movie. I had a hell of a good time watching this. You know, when Albert Finney comes around the corner and shotguns a guy in the chest and then says, "Welcome to Scotland," I was like, hell yeah. What a movie.
See, I can get down with that one-liner because he's just like a throwaway character that I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? Like, that's awesome.
It's so
now,
good.
Bob, I will say, I think every time I hear you say the word 9.5, my like eye twitches a little bit because I remember that that's what you gave The Last Jedi. And I think my brain will always and forever indelibly think Skyfall is so much better than The Last Jedi.
Can I tell you, I literally...
much better.
I have a page of notes on my phone that I've been going through and making sure we hit every topic. And the only remaining item, I swear to God, on this list is mention The Last Jedi just to piss Brad off. That is literally the last thing on here.
I'm just going to finish this episode by saying The Last Jedi is a garbage, horrifically made, poorly executed film.
So,
I can hear the wheels in your head turning on how do I segue us?
Well, we got to end the episode. I was going to bring it up at some point because I was like, it's kind of doing the, you know, grappling with its own lore thing that Last Jedi does. And I didn't know if that would be influencing you at all, but you hadn't even tangentially brought it up. So I was like, I'll set that aside. We'll piss Brad off some other day, but now you've brought it up. So there you go, man. It lives rent-free in your brain, dude.
It is your fault that you gave that terrible movie a 9.5. And so now every future 9.5 that you give is like tainted in my mind. Because I'm like, well, if he gives Last Jedi a 9.5, he could just throw it to any movie.
And throw it I did. Skyfall's a 9.5 out of 10, folks, which is bringing our average to an 8.75 out of 10. But we'd like to know what you think. Is Skyfall the apex of the Bond franchise, or would you pick something else? Let us know on any of our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube @Film Whiskey.
Or you can join the conversation on our Discord server. We are on there every single day trashing Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi. So if you want to join that very important piece of cultural discourse, you can find a link to our Discord server at the end of every single one of our show notes.
Next week, a movie that I cannot wait to talk about. It is David Fincher's 2007 unsung masterpiece, Zodiac. So we'll be back looking at serial killers next week.
Probably going to give it a 9.5.
I absolutely will. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.